She was one of the most talked about women of the 20th century, and not just because of the art. Peggy Guggenheim moved through life like she had nothing to lose and absolutely everything to prove. She collected masterpieces, she collected lovers, and twice she walked down the aisle into marriages that were, by any honest standard, nothing short of catastrophic. Not the quiet kind of catastrophic, the kind that made headlines, ruined careers, and left people wondering how a woman this smart kept ending up in situations like these. But before we get into the marriages, and we absolutely will, there's something you need to understand about where Peggy came from. Because the woman who shocked Paris and Venice didn't appear out of nowhere. She was built, piece by piece, by a childhood that was far stranger and far sadder than most people realize. And once you know that backstory, everything that came after starts to make a different kind of sense. Segment 7. A fortune built on tragedy. Peggy Guggenheim was born on August 26, 1898, in New York City, into one of the wealthiest families in America. The Guggenheims had made their fortune in mining and smelting, silver, copper, lead, and by the time Peggy arrived, the family name was synonymous with serious, almost incomprehensible money. But wealth, as it turns out, doesn't protect you from anything. Her father was Benjamin Guggenheim, a man who was known for his charm, his spending, and his habit of disappearing for long stretches of time. He was not, by most accounts, a devoted family man. He travelled constantly, kept the company of other women openly, and treated domestic life as something that happened to other people. On April 14, 1912, Benjamin Guggenheim boarded the RMS Titanic in Southampton, England, heading back to New York. He was travelling with his valet and, notably, a French singer he had been seeing. When the ship struck the iceberg, the accounts of what happened next became something of a legend. Benjamin reportedly changed out of his life jacket and into his formal evening clothes, reportedly saying that he intended to die like a gentleman. He went down with the ship. He was 46 years old. Peggy was 13. The death of her father was not just a personal loss. It set in motion a financial unraveling that the family worked hard to keep quiet. Benjamin had not been a careful steward of his share of the Guggenheim wealth. By the time his estate was settled, it was considerably smaller than anyone had expected. Peggy's inheritance, held in trust, was substantial by ordinary standards, eventually amounting to several $100,000. But it was a fraction of what her cousins and relatives from the more business-minded branches of the family controlled. That gap, between being a Guggenheim and being treated like a lesser Guggenheim, followed Peggy for decades. She was aware of it, and it made her uncomfortable in ways she rarely admitted directly but acted out constantly. Her mother, Florette Seligman Guggenheim, was a woman described by most who knew her as difficult, unstable, and deeply unhappy after Benjamin's death. She clung to her daughters. Peggy had two sisters, Benita and Hazel, in ways that were more smothering than comforting. The household after Benjamin's death was anxious, erratic, and frequently miserable. Peggy grew up in that atmosphere, surrounded by money and grief, and a mother who couldn't hold herself together in a social world that was glamorous on the surface and brutal underneath. She was awkward as a girl. She was deeply self-conscious about her nose, which she considered her most unfortunate feature, and she carried that insecurity with her into adulthood. She had the nose surgically altered as a young woman, though the result disappointed her, and she later claimed it had made things worse rather than better. What she had, even from a young age, was curiosity. She read voraciously. She paid attention. And she understood, by her late teens, that the world she'd been born into was not the world she wanted to live in. In 1919, when Peggy was 21, She came into a portion of her inheritance and did something that surprised almost everyone who knew her. She left. She moved to Europe, first to London, then to Paris, and she did not look back. Paris in the early 1920s was unlike anywhere else on Earth. The First World War had ended less than 2 years earlier, and the city was in the grip of something between grief and euphoria. Artists, writers, and intellectuals from all over the world had gathered there, drawn by cheap rents, good wine, and the particular freedom that comes from being far from home. Gertrude Stein held her famous salon on the Rue de Fleurus. James Joyce was finishing Ulysses in a cramped apartment. Picasso, Brancusi, Cocteau, they were all there, working and arguing and drinking and falling in and out of love with each other's ideas. Peggy walked straight into the middle of it. She was not yet a collector. She was not yet a patron. She was a young American woman with money, a sharp eye, and an almost desperate desire to be taken seriously by people who mattered. She made friends quickly. She had a gift for that, a genuine warmth that people responded to even when they also found her exhausting. She fell in love with the work being made around her. She fell in love with the people making it. She had worked briefly, before leaving New York, at a bookshop called the Sunwise Turn, a progressive, artistically minded store that exposed her to a circle of writers and thinkers she would not otherwise have encountered. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it planted something in her. The understanding that the world of ideas was accessible, that you didn't have to be born into it to belong there, and that a certain kind of work, the work of paying attention, of being genuinely curious about what other people were making and thinking, could be a form of participation in its own right. In Paris, that instinct found its proper environment. She took French lessons. She visited galleries. She attended readings and openings and dinners that went on until 3 a.m, where arguments about cubism, or the future of the novel, or the correct interpretation of Freud were conducted with the kind of passionate seriousness that people in other contexts reserved for religion. She found it exhilarating. She also found, for the first time in her life, that she could hold her own in these conversations, that her opinions were not just tolerated, but sometimes genuinely sought. The social currency in that world was different from the one she had grown up in. In New York, among the Guggenheim family circle, money was the organizing principle and lineage the context. In Paris, among the artists and writers who congregated in the cafes of Montparnasse, what mattered was what you thought, what you made, and how seriously you took the enterprise of making something. Peggy's money was useful. It always is. But it was not, in itself, what earned her a place at the table. She had to earn that a different way. And she was, in 1921, just beginning to figure out how. And in that world, she met the man who would become her first husband. His name was Lawrence Vale. Segment 6. Lawrence Vale, the King of Bohemia. Lawrence Vale was, in 1921, exactly the kind of man who made sensible people nervous and everyone else wildly curious. He was American-born, but raised largely in France, the product of a Bohemian family that had always lived slightly outside convention. He was tall, handsome, blonde, and moved through Paris with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted that he belonged wherever he happened to be standing. He was a writer and a painter, though his output was erratic. He was better known for his personality than for any specific body of work. His friends called him the King of Bohemia, and it wasn't entirely a compliment. He was also, by multiple accounts, given to violent rages when he drank, which was often. Peggy met him through mutual friends in the Paris art world, and she was immediately captivated. He was everything her upbringing had trained her to avoid: unstable, extravagant, contemptuous of social convention, and completely uninterested in the kind of domestic respectability her mother had always pushed toward. To Peggy, those things were features, not flaws. They married in 1922. Peggy was 23 years old. What followed was a marriage that lasted 8 years and contained more incident than most people experience in a lifetime. In the beginning, there was genuine warmth between them. They travelled constantly through France, Italy, England, living in rented villas and cheap hotels, socializing with artists and writers, spending freely. Peggy later described the early years of the marriage as genuinely happy at times, even joyful. They had 2 children together, a son named Sindbad, born in 1923, and a daughter named Pegin, born in 1925. But the marriage was cracking from the beginning, and the cracks ran deep. Lawrence's rages were not occasional. They were a regular feature of life in the Vale household. When he drank, and he drank a great deal, he became a different person. Aggressive, humiliating, sometimes physically violent. Peggy described incidents over the years that ranged from public screaming matches to situations where she feared for her safety. He threw things. He grabbed her. On multiple occasions, he attacked her in front of other people, including friends, and, on at least one occasion, in front of their children. The social world they moved in was not inclined to intervene. This was Paris in the 1920s, among a crowd that prided itself on being above bourgeois concerns like domestic propriety. Affairs were common, open, and largely accepted. Violence behind closed doors, and sometimes not very far behind them, was treated as a private matter. Friends looked away. Peggy, for her part, stayed. Part of what kept her there, at least in the early years, was the life that surrounded the marriage, even as the marriage itself deteriorated. The 1920s in Paris and on the French Riviera were genuinely extraordinary if you had money and connections, and Peggy had both. They summered in the south of France, where the Murphys, Gerald and Sarah, the golden American expatriate couple who seemed to embody everything glamorous about that era, held court on the Cap d'Antibes. F. Scott Fitzgerald was a recurring presence in those summers. So was Ernest Hemingway and Dos Passos, and a shifting cast of painters, sculptors, and critics who moved between Paris and the Mediterranean with the ease of people for whom the normal constraints of life had temporarily been suspended. Peggy was part of that world, so was Lawrence. Whatever was happening privately between them, publicly, they were a fixture of one of the most celebrated social scenes of the century. That mattered to Peggy more than she would have admitted at the time. The marriage was the cost of entry, and for a long while she was willing to pay it. She also, during these years, began to develop something that would later become her greatest asset: her eye. She was looking at art constantly, in galleries, in studios, in the homes of collectors who showed her their walls the way people in other social worlds might show off their horses. She was forming opinions. She was learning to trust those opinions, even when they ran counter to critical consensus or to the preferences of people who had been in the art world far longer than she had. This was slow work, the work of years, and it was happening almost invisibly alongside the more dramatic events of her marriage. Why she stayed is something she wrestled with in her memoir, written years later. She talked about loving him, about believing he would change, about the children, about the fear of being alone. She also talked about her own pride, admitting that there was a part of her that didn't want to admit she had made a mistake, and a part of her that was convinced, for a long time, that she could fix what was wrong. She couldn't. What accelerated the end of the marriage was not any single incident, but a gradual wearing down combined with the arrival of someone new. Peggy had begun to have affairs of her own by the mid-1920s, partly in response to Lawrence's infidelities, partly as a way of reclaiming some sense of herself as a person rather than a target. She was open about this in later years. She made no apologies for it. In 1928, she fell into a relationship with the English writer John Holmes, and it was with Holmes that she finally found the emotional clarity to leave Lawrence. The divorce was finalized in 1930. It was not clean. Lawrence fought over the children. Custody arrangements were contentious and emotionally brutal for both parents, though Peggy retained primary custody. He also, in the years after the divorce, married the writer Kay Boyle, with whom Peggy had a complicated and frequently hostile relationship that lasted decades. But even after all of it, the rages, the humiliations, the drawn-out divorce, Peggy and Lawrence maintained an uneasy connection, mostly because of their children. He remained in her life, in the background, for the rest of his life. What the marriage with Lawrence Vale did, more than anything, was teach Peggy something she would carry forward, that she was capable of enduring far more than most people would, and that endurance was not the same thing as strength. It also confirmed something she had suspected about herself, that she was drawn to difficult men, brilliant and damaged, and incapable of the kind of steady affection she privately craved. The next man she would marry would prove that pattern had not yet run its course. Segment 5. The years between. Grief, independence, and the making of a collector. Before we get to the second marriage, there's a stretch of Peggy's life, roughly from 1930 to 1938, that is essential to understanding who she became. After leaving Lawrence, she spent several years in England and Europe with John Holmes, the man she considered the great intellectual love of her life. Holmes was a writer of extraordinary promise who produced almost nothing. He was magnetic in conversation, deeply read, and utterly paralyzed when it came to actually putting words on a page. Peggy adored him. She organized her life around him, suppressed her own ambitions to make space for his, and later admitted that she had been, with Holmes, more purely and helplessly in love than at any other point in her life. She and Holmes lived primarily in England, in a farmhouse in the Devon countryside, and the years she spent there were quieter than any other period of her adult life, almost deliberately so, as if she were deliberately stepping back from the intensity of the Paris years to catch her breath. She read widely, walked the English countryside, entertained friends who came to visit, and devoted herself to Holmes with a completeness that she would later, with the distance of years, describe as both the most peaceful and the most self-effacing period of her life. She had essentially disappeared into his world, and she was aware of it, even as she was doing it. In January 1934, Holmes died unexpectedly during a minor surgical procedure. He was 37 years old. The anesthetic was mishandled, and he never recovered from it. Peggy was devastated. She described the loss in terms that made clear it was not just grief, but a kind of disorientation, as if the person who had organized her sense of herself had simply disappeared. She went into a period of depression and aimlessness that lasted for some time. She eventually pulled herself forward, partly through work. In 1938, she opened a gallery in London called Guggenheim Jeune, named with a wink at the famous Parisian gallery Bernheim Jeune. It was her first serious venture as a patron and dealer, and it was where she began to develop the eye and the confidence that would later make her one of the most important collectors of the 20th century. The gallery ran for little more than a year before she closed it, having decided that she wanted to open a museum instead. The plan was ambitious. She wanted to create a permanent home for modern art in London, and she began acquiring work with that goal in mind, consulting with the art critic Herbert Read, who served as an early advisor. The project was interrupted and then radically redirected by the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. What followed was one of the most extraordinary periods of Peggy Guggenheim's life. As France fell to German forces in 1940 and the noose tightened around Paris, Peggy did something that seemed almost absurd. She kept buying art. She later claimed she bought a piece a day during the occupation, moving through dealers and studios with a purposefulness that struck everyone around her as either heroic or deranged. The prices were low because sellers were desperate and buyers were scarce. She bought Léger, Dali, Ernst, Brancusi, Giacometti, Miro, work that would later be valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. She also had to fight to get it out of the country. The French authorities, in the chaos of the occupation, were not making it easy to export anything, and Peggy had to be creative, packing canvases with personal belongings, navigating customs officials, finding routes south when the normal channels closed. She eventually got her collection out, shipping it to New York under the customs declaration household goods, an act of calm nerve that was entirely characteristic of her. She also, in the chaos of those years, made a decision about her personal life. She married again. Segment 4. Max Ernst. The marriage. That art history barely wants to discuss. If the first marriage was a cautionary tale about youth and recklessness, the second one was something more complicated. A collision between two powerful personalities at one of the most volatile moments in modern history, conducted almost entirely in bad faith. Max Ernst was, by 1940, one of the most important artists alive. He was a founding figure of Dada and a central presence in surrealism, the movement that sought to channel the irrational, the dreamlike, and the unconscious into visual art. His paintings were hallucinatory and precise, filled with forests and birds and creatures that existed somewhere between nightmare and fairy tale. He was German-born, charismatic, physically striking, and at 50 years old when he met Peggy, possessed of the kind of weathered authority that can make a person seem more substantial than they are. He was also in serious trouble. When Germany invaded France, Ernst, as a German national and an artist whose work had been officially condemned by the Nazi regime as degenerate, was in immediate danger. He had already been interned twice by French authorities in the early months of the war, held in camps with other German nationals regardless of their politics or their status as refugees from the very regime France was nominally fighting. The situation was absurd and terrifying in equal measure. Peggy had known Ernst slightly for years through the Paris art world. When she encountered him again in 1940, in the desperate scramble of wartime Paris, she began buying his work, and then began something else entirely. They became romantically involved. Peggy was 41. Ernst was 49. He was also, at the time, involved with another woman, the surrealist painter Leonora Carrington, with whom he had been deeply entangled for years before the war had separated them. Carrington, stranded in Spain after Ernst's internment, had suffered a severe mental breakdown. Ernst, whatever he felt for her, was no longer in a position, or perhaps no longer willing, to be the person who helped her. Peggy stepped in. She used her American citizenship and her money to help arrange visas and passage out of Europe for a group of artists and intellectuals, Ernst among them. This was genuinely courageous work. The logistics were nightmarish, the bureaucracy hostile, and the stakes, for the people involved, were life and death. Peggy navigated it with determination and, in many cases, personal financial support. She also made clear to Ernst that her help came with an expectation, not stated openly, she was too shrewd for that, but present nonetheless. Ernst understood the arrangement. They arrived in New York in July 1941, and on December 30th of that year, 5 months after arriving in the United States, Peggy Guggenheim and Max Ernst were married. Almost no one who knew either of them thought it was a good idea. The marriage was troubled from the start, in ways that were visible to everyone in their social circle. Ernst had not stopped loving Leonora Carrington. He had simply lost access to her. When Carrington eventually made her own way to New York, the situation became quietly agonizing for Peggy, who was aware that her husband's feelings for his former partner had not simply evaporated because they were now in different circumstances. More immediately disruptive was the arrival of Dorothea Tanning, an American surrealist painter who was young, beautiful, and directly in front of Ernst at exactly the wrong moment. Ernst met Tanning at a party in 1942, barely a year into the marriage. He was immediately and obviously taken with her. What followed was not a brief flirtation, but a deepening connection that Ernst made little effort to conceal from Peggy or from anyone else. He and Tanning spent increasing amounts of time together. The art world, which runs on gossip and observation in roughly equal measure, noticed immediately. Peggy's response to this was complex. By her own account, she was not simply hurt. She was angry, and she expressed that anger in characteristically Peggy fashion, not by retreating, but by escalating. She continued to run her gallery, which had opened in New York in October 1942 under the name Art of This Century. The gallery was a sensation, housed in a space designed by the architect Friedrich Kiesler in a way that was itself a work of art, with curved walls, rope-hung canvases, and theatrical lighting that made the experience of looking at art feel genuinely new. The gallery became one of the most important venues in New York, launching or supporting the careers of artists, including Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, and Mark Rothko. The Pollock relationship deserves a moment of its own. Peggy had been introduced to him by the artist and critic Howard Putzel, who worked with her and had strong views about which younger American painters merited attention. Pollock was not, when Peggy first encountered his work, an easy sell. His paintings were large, violent, and technically unlike anything being made in New York at the time. Several of the European surrealists who moved through Peggy's circle were skeptical. Even Mondrian, whose judgment Peggy respected, initially had reservations about Pollock, though he later revised them after seeing more of the work. Peggy trusted her own instincts. She commissioned Pollock to paint a mural for the entrance hall of her townhouse, a canvas roughly 8 feet high and nearly 20 feet wide. The story of how it got made is itself a piece of art world mythology. Pollock reportedly stared at the blank canvas for months without touching it, and then, the night before the deadline, painted the entire mural in a single extended session. Whether or not every detail of that story is strictly accurate, the result was a work of startling power. Peggy showed it, championed it, and gave Pollock the institutional support that allowed him to keep working. The rest of that story, the drip paintings, the international fame, the position as the defining figure of abstract expressionism, came later, but the foundation was laid at Art of This Century. Ernst, meanwhile, was barely present in the work that was making Peggy's reputation. He had his own career to manage, his own ambitions, and his own increasingly consuming relationship with Tanning. The marriage ended in 1943, less than 2 years after it began, when Ernst and Peggy separated. The divorce was finalized in 1946. Ernst married Dorothea Tanning that same year, and the two remained together for the rest of his life. Peggy, characteristically, did not disappear. She continued the gallery, continued collecting, and eventually made the decision, in 1947, to leave New York and return to Europe. She settled in Venice, in a palazzo on the Grand Canal called the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, which she purchased and which became her permanent home, her exhibition space, and eventually her legacy. She never married again. Segment 3. What the marriages cost her, and what she refused to lose. It would be easy, looking at these two marriages, to tell a simple story about a woman who chose badly and paid for it. But that story would leave out most of what is actually interesting. Peggy Guggenheim was not naive. She was not, in any straightforward sense, a victim of the men she married, though she was at times treated very badly by them. She made choices with her eyes open, and she understood, or came to understand, that those choices were expressions of something deep in her own makeup, a hunger for intensity, a tolerance for disorder, and a persistent belief that genius, or at least the aura of it, justified a great deal. The marriage to Lawrence Vale cost her years of physical and emotional safety. She lived, for extended periods, in a state of genuine fear. She brought 2 children into a household that was frequently chaotic and occasionally dangerous. The effects on those children, Sindbad and Peggy, were real and lasting. Sinbad grew up to live a largely quiet life, largely out of his mother's orbit. Peggy's story was darker. Peggy Vale Guggenheim grew up between her parents' warring households, absorbing the instability of both. She became a painter of genuine talent. Her work was delicate, peculiar, and undervalued for years, partly because of who her mother was. She married multiple times herself, had children, struggled throughout her adult life with depression and emotional fragility. In 1967, Peggy died in Paris. She was 41 years old. The circumstances suggested she had taken her own life, though the details were never made fully public, and Peggy, for the rest of her life, found the subject too painful to address directly. She had been in Venice when it happened. She did not discuss it at length in interviews. Those who knew her said she never recovered from it. The marriage to Max Ernst cost Peggy something different. Her dignity, in the specific and grinding way that comes from being publicly, obviously, second best to a woman your husband prefers. She had helped Ernst escape Europe. She had brought him to safety. She had married him. And he had turned almost immediately towards someone else, with very little apparent guilt and no particular discretion. What kept Peggy from being defined by these losses was work. The gallery, art of this century, was her answer to everything the marriages had taken from her. It was hers, funded by her money, driven by her eye, shaped by her instincts. When she championed Jackson Pollock, when she gave him a contract, included him in group shows, and eventually gave him his first solo exhibition in 1943, she was acting entirely on her own judgment, against the skepticism of almost everyone around her. She was right, and the world eventually caught up. She brought the same clarity to her decision to move to Venice, to open the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni to the public, to build what became one of the greatest private collections of modern art in the world. She did all of this without a husband, without institutional support, and with the kind of stubborn self-reliance that the marriages, for all their cost, had paradoxically helped forge in her. Segment 2. Venice, the collection, and the question she never quite answered. In the last decades of her life, Peggy Guggenheim became something she had never expected to be, a monument. She lived in the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, a low, spreading building on the Grand Canal that had never been finished, which was part of its charm, from 1949 until her death. She opened the palazzo's garden and ground floor to the public each summer, and the collection she had assembled, Ernst, Picasso, Braque, Mondrian, Pollock, de Kooning, Calder, Duchamp, and dozens of others, drew visitors from around the world. She was impossible to miss in Venice. She was small, frequently barefoot or in sandals, always in large sunglasses, often with one of the small dogs she adored tucked under her arm. She was a fixture at the Biennale, at gallery openings, at canal-side dinners. She was generous with her time for people she found interesting and withering to those she didn't. She wrote a memoir, first published in 1946 under a deliberately provocative title, later revised and republished in 1960 as Confessions of an Art Addict and more fully as Out of This Century. The book was frank to a degree that shocked many of its first readers. She wrote about her marriages, her lovers. She catalogued them with a specificity that made some of her former companions furious, and her relationships with her children with an honesty that was sometimes brutal and sometimes, it must be said, somewhat self-serving. She didn't cast herself as a saint. She also didn't go out of her way to cast herself as the villain. What came through, in the memoir and in the decades of interviews that followed its publication, was the central tension of her life. A woman who had everything the world said you needed: money, beauty, famous friends, artistic achievement, and who had also been, repeatedly and sometimes devastatingly, alone. The marriages had not given her what she wanted. What she wanted, when she let herself admit it, was to be loved with the same intensity and steadiness she was capable of giving. Lawrence Vale had been too angry. John Holmes had died. Max Ernst had been elsewhere, emotionally, almost from the beginning. The others, the long string of lovers and companions who moved through her life, had been, in the end, companions rather than partners. She was asked, in an interview late in her life, how many lovers she had had. She reportedly gave a number, a large one, and then added, with the dry humour that was her default mode, that she couldn't be entirely sure of the count. The anecdote became famous, retold as a kind of proof of her liberation, her defiance of convention. It was also, if you read it a different way, a woman describing a search that never quite ended. She continued to add to the collection into her 70s, though at a slower pace. She lobbied for years to ensure its preservation, eventually arranging for it to pass to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation after her death, a negotiation that was itself complicated by her ambivalence toward the institutional branch of her family, whose support she had never entirely trusted or forgiven for its condescension in earlier decades. She died on December 23rd, 1979, in Campo San Piero, Italy, following a stroke. She was 81 years old. Her ashes were buried in the garden of the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, alongside the graves of her dogs, in a corner of the property she had loved most. The palazzo and its collection are now the Peggy Guggenheim collection, one of the most visited museums in Italy, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Segment 1. The real legacy of the two marriages. So what do we actually make of the two marriages, Lawrence Vale and Max Ernst, when we look at them clearly? The easy version is this: she married twice, was treated badly twice, and survived both times. That's true as far as it goes. But the fuller version is more interesting. Both men were artists. Both were charismatic and difficult, and, in their own ways, magnetic. Both required Peggy to subordinate some part of herself, her safety with Vale, her dignity with Ernst, in order to maintain the relationship. Both marriages ended badly, in ways that were painful and public and, in Vale's case, physically dangerous. And yet, Lawrence Vale introduced Peggy to the world she would spend the rest of her life in. He was the door through which she walked into bohemian Paris, into the art world, into the social universe that shaped her taste and her ambitions, and her understanding of what was possible. Without him, It is genuinely difficult to trace the path that leads to art of this century and the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni. That doesn't excuse the violence or the humiliation. It's simply true. Max Ernst was part of her collection before he was her husband. When she was still buying his work in wartime Paris, she was recognizing something real: the significance of the work, the importance of the artist. The marriage itself was a mistake, or at least a miscalculation. But the eye that had recognized Ernst's work as significant was the same eye that recognized Pollock, that shaped one of the defining collections of the 20th century. The judgment that failed her personally did not fail her professionally. There is also the question of what the marriages made visible about the world Peggy moved through. The Paris art world of the 1920s and 1930s, for all its radicalism and its ostentatious liberation from bourgeois values, had a very traditional relationship with the women inside it. They were patrons, models, muses, lovers, but rarely, in their own right, the figures being celebrated. Peggy occupied all of those roles at various points in her life, and she chafed against the limitations of each of them. What she eventually became, a collector and a curator and an institution in the deepest sense, was something different from all of those categories. It was something she largely had to invent as she went, because there wasn't a ready-made template for what she was doing. And the marriages, for all their cost, were part of the education that got her there. She paid a high price for that education. Her children paid parts of it that were not theirs to pay. That's worth sitting with. And Peggy, in her more honest moments, sat with it. But the woman who was buried in the garden of the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, surrounded by the art she had spent a lifetime gathering, was not a woman who had been defined by what happened to her in those marriages. She was a woman who had, despite everything, defined herself. That distinction, between being shaped by your history and being consumed by it, is the thing that makes Peggy Guggenheim's story worth knowing. Not because it's comfortable or because it offers a clean lesson, but because it's true in the way that complicated things are true, fully and without resolution, and with the kind of staying power that only comes from having actually happened. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There are people who seem to have everything, and then there is Christina Onassis. Born into one of the greatest fortunes the world has ever known, she had access to private islands, fleets of ships, and more money than most countries. She travelled the world. She was photographed everywhere. And yet, by the time she was in her late 30s, the people closest to her described a woman who was deeply, quietly, desperately unhappy. She married 4 times. Each marriage promised something: stability, love, companionship, a fresh start. And each one, in its own way, left her more alone than before. This is not a story about wealth. It is a story about what wealth cannot fix. About a woman who spent her entire life searching for something she could never quite hold on to. Segment 8. The world she was born into. To understand Christina, you have to understand the family she came from, because it shaped everything. Her father, Aristotle Onassis, was one of the most famous and powerful men of the 20th century. He had grown up with very little in Smyrna, in what is now Turkey, and had built himself, through sheer relentlessness, into a shipping magnate whose name became synonymous with a particular kind of extravagant, almost mythological wealth. He owned tankers, airlines, and an entire island, Skorpios, off the coast of Greece. He kept company with presidents, opera singers, and royalty. He was brash, charismatic, and utterly dominating. Christina's mother was Athena Livanos, the daughter of another powerful Greek shipping family. Athena was considered one of the great beauties of her time: elegant, refined, and by most accounts deeply unhappy in her marriage to Aristotle. She and Aristotle had two children, Alexander, who was born in 1948, and Christina, born on December 11th, 1950, in New York City. From the very beginning, Christina's childhood was anything but ordinary. She grew up between Manhattan, Paris, and Monte Carlo. There were yachts and private jets and houses staffed with servants. But there was also constant movement, constant instability, and parents who were far more absorbed in their own dramatic lives than in the quiet work of raising a child. Aristotle Onassis was not, by most accounts, a warm or attentive father, at least not to Christina. He adored Alexander, his son, in that particular way powerful men sometimes fixate on a male heir. Christina always felt that imbalance. She was not ignored exactly, but she was never the center of his attention in the way she needed to be. Her mother, Athena, divorced Aristotle in 1960 when Christina was 9 years old. That, in itself, was already a rupture. But what followed made it worse. Athena remarried fairly quickly to a man named Stavros Niarchos, who happened to be Aristotle's great rival in the shipping world. The choice seemed almost designed to wound, and it did. Christina grew up caught between two enormous egos, two enormous fortunes, and a family dynamic that was more like a Greek tragedy than a household. She was sent to schools in Switzerland and England, as was customary for children of that class. She was not particularly scholarly. She was, by her own admission, someone who preferred socializing, who needed connection, who found academic solitude difficult. What she wanted, more than anything really, was to be loved simply, without all the complication her name brought with it. That would prove to be harder than it sounds. By the time she was a teenager, Christina was already aware that her name and her money changed every room she walked into. People wanted things from her family. Men wanted things. Women wanted access. It was nearly impossible to tell who was genuine and who was not, and that uncertainty, that inability to simply trust, would follow her for the rest of her life. Then, in 1968, something happened that genuinely shocked the world and changed everything for Christina. Her father married Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy, widow of the assassinated American president, one of the most recognizable and admired women on earth, became Christina's stepmother. Christina was 17 years old. She did not take it well. That would be putting it mildly. Christina reportedly found the marriage baffling and humiliating. To her, Jackie represented everything alien and cold about American culture. She called her, in private conversations that were later repeated widely, names that left little room for diplomatic interpretation. The two women never found common ground. Not really. Jackie moved through the Onassis world with composure and distance, and Christina watched her father lavish attention and resources on this new wife, while she, his own daughter, remained on the periphery. And then, grief arrived, in waves that did not stop. In January 1973, Alexander Onassis was involved in a plane crash. He had been learning to fly, and something went wrong during takeoff at the Athens airport. He suffered catastrophic brain injuries and never recovered. He died in February 1973, at 24 years old. Alexander had been Christina's closest companion, her brother, the one person in the family who truly belonged to the same generation, the same experience. His death left a hole in her that never fully closed. Aristotle Onassis never recovered either. He had invested so much of his emotional life in his son, in the idea of an heir, that Alexander's death seemed to break something fundamental in him. He began to decline physically. By 1974, He was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a serious neuromuscular disease. His health deteriorated steadily. He died in March 1975 in Paris at the age of 69. In the span of 2 years, Christina had lost her brother and her father. She was 24 years old, and she was now, suddenly, one of the wealthiest women in the world. She inherited the Onassis empire, the shipping lines, the island, the fortune estimated at the time at somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion. It was an almost incomprehensible sum, and she inherited it completely alone, at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. By the time her first marriage came around, Christina had already been through more loss than most people experience in a lifetime. She was searching for something solid. She was searching for someone who would simply stay. And that search, urgent, desperate, and sometimes reckless, is where the real story begins. Segment 7. Joseph Bolker, The First Escape. Christina's first marriage was, in many ways, an act of rebellion more than anything else. In the summer of 1971, before Alexander's death, before her father's decline, but already after years of feeling unseen and peripheral in her own family, Christina met Joseph Bolker at a party in Monte Carlo. He was an American real estate developer from Los Angeles. He was charming, attentive, and genuinely warm. He was also 47 years old. Christina was 20. The age gap was 27 years. Bolker had been married before, 4 times, in fact. He had 4 daughters. He was, in nearly every practical sense, the opposite of what Aristotle Onassis would have wanted for his daughter. He was not Greek. He was not from a prominent family. He was not part of the world that Aristotle had spent his life building. And that, almost certainly, was part of the appeal. Christina had grown up surrounded by arrangements, social, financial, dynastic. Everything in her world seemed to serve a purpose beyond the purely human. Bolker offered something different. He paid attention to her. He seemed to genuinely like her for who she was, not for what she represented. They married in Las Vegas on July 27th, 1971, in a ceremony that was, by the standards of either of their worlds, remarkably understated. There was no grand announcement. There was no gathering of luminaries. They simply got married. Aristotle Onassis was furious. That is not quite a strong enough word. He was reportedly incandescent, threatening to disinherit Christina, making it clear through intermediaries and directly that he considered the marriage an embarrassment and a mistake. He applied pressure in the way that only extremely powerful men with enormous resources can, relentlessly, from every direction. Christina held on for about 9 months. The marriage ended in 1972. The official reasons were vague: incompatibility, the difficulties of long distance, the pressures from her family. Bolker himself, in later interviews, spoke about Christina with genuine fondness and a kind of sad resignation. He said she was a lovely person who was simply overwhelmed by her family, by her circumstances, by forces much larger than either of them. He was not wrong. The divorce was quiet. There was no real acrimony. But what it represented was significant. Christina had tried, for the first time, to build something on her own terms, and the world around her, beginning with her own father, had made it impossible. She returned to the Onassis fold. And then, as we've already seen, everything fell apart in a different way entirely. Alexander died, her father died, and by 1975 she was carrying all of that alone. It is worth pausing here for a moment, because the emotional weight of what Christina was carrying at 24 is genuinely difficult to comprehend. 2 devastating bereavements in quick succession. The collapse of the family structure she had grown up within, however imperfect it was. a first marriage that had lasted less than a year, and now an inheritance of almost unimaginable proportions, with all the responsibility and all the scrutiny that came with it. She needed someone. That need, honest, human, and completely understandable, would drive the next chapter of her life into territory that almost no one saw coming. Segment 6. Alexander Andriadis, the respectable option. After the chaos of the Bolker marriage, and after the grief of 1973 and 1975, Christina seemed to make a more considered choice the second time. In 1975, not long after her father's death, she became involved with Alexander Andriadis, the son of a prominent Greek shipping and banking family. His father, Stratis Andriadis, was a well-known banker and industrialist. On paper, this was almost exactly the kind of match that Aristotle Onassis would have approved of. Greek, wealthy, from the right world, with the right name. They married in July 1975, just months after Aristotle's death. The speed of it raised a few eyebrows, but Christina seemed genuinely taken with him, and there was something that felt, at least from the outside, like it could be stable. She was still raw from grief, still adjusting to the weight of the inheritance she had just received, still searching for some kind of anchor. Andriadis seemed, on the surface, to be a reasonable one. Andriadis was handsome and confident. He came from money, which theoretically meant he was not after hers. He understood the Greek shipping world. He spoke her language, literally and figuratively. And for a woman who had spent years feeling like an outsider in rooms full of insiders, there was something genuinely comforting about being with someone who came from the same enclosed world she did. But the marriage almost immediately began to struggle. What emerged, over the following months, was a picture of two people who were fundamentally incompatible in ways that the match on paper could not account for. Andriadis had a forceful personality and strong opinions about how a marriage should function, how a wife should behave, what priorities should look like. Christina was used to being, despite everything, independent. She ran a vast business empire. She made decisions. She was not someone who could easily fold herself into a secondary role. The contrast between them was sharper than either may have anticipated going in. Christina had inherited a company, and she was running it, seriously, with real attention and real authority. She was sitting in boardrooms, making calls about oil tankers and international contracts, asserting herself in ways that surprised some of the men around her who had expected her to be a figurehead. She had her father's instinct for business, even if she had not always been credited with it. Having a husband who expected to be the dominant voice in the partnership made for a tense domestic arrangement. The two of them apparently clashed frequently. The warmth that had characterized the early months of their relationship cooled quickly under the pressure of day-to-day reality. There were also, by various accounts, significant tensions around the Onassis fortune itself. The business interests of the two families did not always align as smoothly as might have been hoped. And Christina, who was by this point genuinely in control of the Onassis companies, was not inclined to subordinate those interests to anyone, certainly not to a husband's family. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. They divorced in 1977. It had been, in the end, a reasonable idea that simply did not survive contact with reality. Christina was not someone who could be managed or contained, not by grief, not by expectation, not by a husband who thought he knew what the situation required. She walked away from the Andriadis marriage perhaps more clear-eyed than she had been after the Bolker one. That first marriage had ended under external pressure. Her father, her circumstances, forces beyond her control. This one had ended because of something more internal, a fundamental mismatch between who she was and what the marriage expected her to be. The lesson, if there was one, was that respectability on paper was not the same as happiness in practice. Two marriages down, two very different failures. And somewhere in the back of her mind, perhaps, the beginning of a suspicion that what she was looking for might not actually exist. But then came the third marriage, and this one was different from anything that had come before. Segment 5. Sergei Kausov, the Soviet chapter. If the Bolka marriage was an act of rebellion, the marriage to Sergei Kausov was something else entirely. Something that stunned the people around her, alarmed governments, and made headlines around the world in a way that neither of her previous marriages had. Sergei Kausov was a Soviet citizen. In the late 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, that was not a minor detail. It was an enormous one. Christina met Kausov in the mid-1970s through business, specifically through negotiations related to the Onassis shipping fleet's dealings with the Soviet Union. He was working for a Soviet state shipping agency. He was not from money. He was not glamorous in any conventional sense. He was not well connected in the way that Christina's previous partners had been. He was, however, apparently attentive in exactly the way she responded to. And for Christina, attentiveness had always mattered more than almost anything else. They were married in Moscow in August 1978. It was, without any exaggeration, one of the most talked-about marriages of the decade. The heiress to the Onassis fortune, one of the richest women in the world, had married a Soviet official in the middle of the Cold War. The CIA reportedly took an interest. The Greek government was unhappy. The Western press went into a frenzy. Christina seemed almost to enjoy the chaos, at least initially. There was something in her that had always responded to the idea of doing the unexpected thing, the thing that confounded people's expectations. She had done it with Bolka. She was doing it again, on a vastly larger scale. She moved to Moscow. She lived, at least for stretches of time, in a Soviet apartment, a dramatic contrast to the private islands and luxury hotels she had spent her life in. She reportedly found it strange, even difficult. The constraints of Soviet daily life, the greyness of Moscow winters, the absence of the kind of freedom of movement she had always taken for granted. These were not small adjustments. The Moscow that Christina entered in the late 1970s was a city defined by scarcity and surveillance. Ordinary consumer goods that she would have taken completely for granted in Paris or Monte Carlo simply did not exist in Soviet shops. Travel outside the country required permissions. Social life operated within very different rules. For a woman who had grown up moving freely between continents, staying in whatever hotel or house she chose, spending whatever she needed to spend, the adjustment was jarring. People in her circle found it difficult to understand. Some thought she had lost her mind entirely. Others suspected a darker motive somewhere, that Kausov must have something over her, or that the Soviet connection served some business purpose that was not immediately apparent. But those who knew Christina well tended toward a simpler explanation. She was in love, and when she was in love, she followed. It had been true with Bolka. It was true here, but she stayed, for a while. The marriage lasted approximately 2 years. By 1980, it was over. What went wrong is something that has been debated and speculated upon ever since. Some accounts suggest Kausov was never particularly in love with her, that the relationship was more complicated than it appeared. Others point to the sheer impossibility of the life they were trying to build, straddling two worlds that were, in almost every practical sense, incompatible. Christina eventually returned to the West, to her shipping empire, to the life she had been born into. Kausov remained in the Soviet Union, though he would later move to the West after the USSR's eventual collapse. What the Moscow chapter revealed to those watching, and perhaps to Christina herself, was the depth of her longing. She had given up extraordinary comfort and freedom to be with this man. She had moved to one of the most closed societies on earth. She had done all of that, and it still had not been enough. After Moscow, there was a period of instability and searching. Christina travelled. She spent time on Scorpios, the island her father had loved. She threw herself back into managing the Onassis companies, which she did with surprising competence. She had more of her father in her than people sometimes acknowledged. But she was also, by this point, struggling with things that went beyond heartbreak. Christina had long had a complicated relationship with her body. From adolescence, she had fluctuated in weight significantly. She had gone through periods of extreme dieting, sometimes losing dramatic amounts of weight, sometimes regaining it. The pressures on her were intense. She was famous, she was photographed constantly, and she was a woman in a world that had very specific and cruel ideas about what women who looked like her were supposed to look like. She also began using barbiturates, sedatives, with increasing regularity during this period. Sleep had always been difficult. The anxiety that ran through her life had always been present. Medication offered some relief, and she relied on it more and more. This is important context, not because it diminishes her, but because it helps explain the urgency with which she approached her fourth marriage. She was not simply a romantic who kept getting unlucky. She was a woman in genuine pain, looking for something, anything, that would make the pain smaller. Segment 4. Thierry Roussel, The Last Hope. The fourth marriage is the one that haunts the story most. Thierry Roussel was a French businessman, the heir to a pharmaceutical fortune. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and charming in that particular way that some people have. A charm that is hard to name precisely, but impossible to miss. Christina met him in the early 1980s, and by most accounts, she fell for him completely. Not cautiously, not with the measured calculation of the Andreadis marriage, or the rebellious impulsiveness of the Bolka one. She fell for Roussel the way people fall when they have been hoping for a long time and have almost given up. He was her great hope. They married on December 17th, 1984, 6 days after Christina's 34th birthday. And within a year, something happened that genuinely transformed her. She became pregnant. On January 29th, 1985, Christina gave birth to a daughter. She named her Athena, after her mother. People who knew Christina described the arrival of Athena as something close to a miracle for her. She had always wanted a child. She had spoken about it for years. And here, finally, was someone who was entirely hers. Someone who did not want anything from her except the simplest things: warmth, presence, love. Christina reportedly threw herself into motherhood with a completeness that surprised even those who knew her well. But the marriage to Roussel was already in trouble. The problem was Roussel himself. Even before the wedding, even before Christina's pregnancy, Roussel had an ongoing relationship with another woman, a Swedish model named Gabby Landhage. This was not a secret that stayed secret for long, and by the time Athena was born, the situation had become something that Christina could not ignore. Gabby Landhage gave birth to a child of Roussel's just months before Athena was born. Let that land for a moment. Christina had married a man who was, at the same time, having a child with another woman. The pain of that discovery, or more precisely, the pain of being unable to walk away from it because she was so thoroughly in love with him, shaped the last years of her life. She did not immediately end the marriage. She tried. She tried to make it work in the way that people try to make things work when they love someone more than they love their own dignity. She spent enormous amounts of money on Roussel, money that he accepted with remarkable ease. She bought him a yacht. She funded business ventures. She gave him access to a lifestyle that his own considerable family fortune could not have supported in quite the same style. She tried to be what he wanted. She tried to hold the marriage together, even as it came apart in her hands. There were periods, reportedly, where Christina believed she had found a way through, where Roussel seemed more present, more attentive, where the marriage appeared to be steadying itself. And then the reality of his other life would reassert itself, and she would be back where she started. The cruelty of it, unintentional perhaps, but cruelty nonetheless, was that Gabby Landhug was not a passing distraction. She was a constant. Roussel was building something with her at the same time he was nominally committed to Christina. His children with Gabby were growing up alongside Athena. The parallel lives were not a secret, and the social world in which Christina moved was not a large one. She knew. Everyone knew. Roussel, for his part, was not unkind in any dramatic sense. He was simply not in love with her. He was fond of her, perhaps. He respected the mother of his daughter. But his heart was elsewhere, and Christina knew it. The divorce came in 1987. It was quiet. There was no great public scene. Christina retained custody of Athena. Roussel went back to Gabby Landhug, whom he would eventually marry. Christina was 36 years old. She had been married 4 times. She had a young daughter whom she adored, and she was, by most accounts, the loneliest she had ever been. Segment 3. The final years. After the divorce from Roussel, Christina threw herself into 2 things: her daughter and her social life. Athena was the center of everything. Christina moved between her various homes, Paris, Switzerland, her apartment in Buenos Aires, and Scorpios, always with Athena nearby. She hired nurses, governesses, staff. She wanted Athena to have everything. More than that, she wanted Athena to have her, which was not always easy, given the state Christina was in. Because the truth is that by the mid to late 1980s, Christina was not well. The weight fluctuations had continued. She had gone through another dramatic round of crash dieting and had lost a significant amount of weight in a short period of time. The barbiturate use had not diminished. Her sleep was poor. She was spending heavily on parties, on friends, on a lifestyle that kept her surrounded by people even as she remained fundamentally alone. The social life she built around herself in these final years was real, in its way. She was generous. She hosted people lavishly. She could still be funny and warm and present when she was in the right state of mind. But there was also something increasingly fragile about her. Friends who spent time with her during this period later described a woman who was simultaneously the life of whatever room she was in and deeply, privately exhausted. She was also still managing the Onassis business interests, still showing up for meetings, still involved in decisions about the shipping fleet. The company was eventually sold to a Greek consortium in 1988, a transaction that had been in the works for some time. It was a significant moment, the end of the Onassis shipping empire as a family enterprise, though by this point Christina had other things pressing on her mind. She had an extensive social circle in Buenos Aires, where she spent a great deal of time in the months before her death. The Argentine capital had a large and lively Greek expatriate community, and Christina found something there that she found difficult in Paris or Athens, a kind of anonymity, almost, a place where she could be herself without the full weight of her name pressing down on her. The city suited her, or at least suited the version of herself she was trying to be in those final months. She went out. She saw friends. She spent time with people who made her laugh. There were evenings that, by all accounts, seemed genuinely good, easy, warm, the kind of ordinary social comfort that had always been the thing she wanted most. She had friends she trusted in Buenos Aires. She liked the city. In many ways, it felt like somewhere she could breathe. She was there, staying at the home of her friend Jorge Chomlek-Joglu when she died. On November 19th, 1988, Christina Onassis was found in her room. She was 37 years old. She had been apparently healthy the evening before. There had been a dinner. There had been conversation. There had been nothing obvious to alarm anyone. The cause of death was given as acute pulmonary edema, a build-up of fluid in the lungs. It was sudden. It was, in some ways, unexpected, though those who knew about the strain on her body over the years perhaps saw it less as a surprise and more as an ending that had been quietly approaching. She was buried on Scorpios, next to her father and her brother. 3 members of the same small family, all gone far too young, all buried on that small island in the Ionian Sea that Aristotle had once bought as a symbol of everything he had achieved. Christina was 37. Athena was 3. Segment 2. What was left behind. Athena Onassis, the little girl Christina had called her miracle, grew up as one of the wealthiest children in the world and one of the most fought over. After Christina's death, the custody and guardianship battles that followed were intense. Thierry Roussel, as Athena's father, became her primary caretaker. He raised her in Switzerland with Gabi Landhage, away from the Greek world that had defined her mother's life. The Onassis family and the Onassis Foundation remained in the background, legally, financially, but at a remove from the girl herself. The Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, which had been established in memory of Christina's brother, continued to operate after Christina's death and managed the portion of the Onassis assets that had been structured as a foundation. It funded scholarships, cultural programs, and the arts, particularly in Greece and the United States, and it continues to operate to this day. In that sense, the Onassis name lives on in a form that Aristotle himself might have recognized: large, public, and impossible to ignore. But the personal inheritance, the money that was Christina's to pass on, went to Athena. She held it in trust until she turned 18, at which point the fortune, estimated at somewhere in the region of $2.5 billion, passed fully into her hands. The trustees and lawyers who had managed it during her childhood stepped back. Athena, who had grown up deliberately shielded from the full weight of what was coming to her, suddenly held one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. She handled it with a quietness that was almost striking given the family she came from. Athena grew up largely out of the public eye, which was perhaps the greatest gift that could have been given to her. She developed a passion for equestrian sport, show jumping specifically, and pursued it with genuine dedication, competing internationally and building a reputation in that world based on her own skill rather than her name. She later married a Brazilian equestrian, Álvaro de Miranda Neto, known in the show jumping world as Doda. They were together for years and married in 2005. The marriage eventually ended, but Athena remained committed to the sport. She built a life that was, in many ways, quieter and more personal than anything her mother had ever managed to have. What Christina left behind was not just money. It was a name, a story, and a strange kind of legacy. The legacy of a woman who had more than almost anyone alive and who spent her life trying to find the one thing that could not be bought or inherited. Segment 1. The Shape of a Life. Looking back at the 4 marriages, Bolker, Andriadis, Kausov, Roussel, what strikes you most is how different they all were. There was no type, Not really. There was no pattern that can be easily reduced to a simple explanation. Joseph Bolker was warmth and rebellion. Alexander Andreadis was respectability and expectation. Sergei Kauzov was something harder to name, perhaps the desire to be chosen by someone who had nothing to gain from choosing her. And Thierry Roussel was love, plain and complicated, and ultimately unreturned. Each man represented something she needed, and each time, reality did not cooperate. What is also worth noting is how public each of these failures was. Christina did not have the luxury of private grief. Every marriage was tracked, every divorce was reported, every weight fluctuation was photographed and printed in magazines across Europe and America. She could not stumble without an audience. She could not try again without the press cataloguing exactly what she was doing and speculating, often cruelly, about why she kept getting it wrong. That exposure had a cost. It made honesty difficult. It made vulnerability almost impossible. When the whole world is watching you fall, the instinct is to pretend you are not falling, to keep moving, keep entertaining, keep smiling at dinner parties, keep appearing in the pages of magazines, looking like someone who has everything under control. Christina was, by many accounts, quite good at that performance. But performances are exhausting, and they do not substitute for the real thing. Christina Onassis was not a tragic figure because she was unhappy. Plenty of people are unhappy. She was tragic in the particular way that only certain lives are, because the gap between what she had and what she needed was so visible, so stark, so impossible to close. The money was real. The island was real. The ships were real. And the loneliness was just as real as any of it. She was also, and this gets lost sometimes in the more dramatic retellings, a person of genuine capability. She ran one of the world's largest private shipping companies at 24 years old, in an industry that was almost entirely male-dominated, at a time when no one would have blamed her for simply handing it over to someone else. She navigated the political complexities of the Cold War through her Soviet marriage without losing her business or her standing. She made decisions, hard ones, and she made them herself. She was also funny, according to those who knew her well, sharp, generous to a fault with the people she loved. She had a gift for friendship, even if she had less luck with marriage. The people who genuinely knew her, not the tabloid version, not the heiress behaving badly version, but the actual woman, tended to speak of her with real warmth. She was loyal. She was curious. She cared about the people around her in ways that were direct and unguarded. The tragedy is not that she made bad choices. The tragedy is that she made very human choices. Choices that any person who wanted love and connection might make. And the circumstances of her life made those choices more consequential, more visible, and ultimately more costly than they would have been for someone living a smaller, quieter life. What she did not have, ever, was someone who simply loved her the way she loved them, steadily, fully, without reservation or agenda. And that, in the end, is the thing that stays with you. Christina Onassis was born into a world that most people can barely imagine, and she spent her 37 years trying to find something inside it that the world kept refusing to give her. 4 marriages, 4 attempts at something ordinary, connection, companionship, a person to come home to. 4 endings that came too soon, in rooms that were never quite the right rooms, with men who were never quite the right men. She died on a November night in Buenos Aires, far from the island her father had bought, far from the life she had been born into, and in some ways, still looking. Her daughter Athena carries her name forward now, quietly, privately, on her own terms. And somewhere on Scorpios, on that small island in the Ionian Sea. Three members of one of the most famous families in the world lie buried together. Aristotle, who built everything. Alexander, who never got the chance to inherit it. And Christina, who did inherit it, and who spent the rest of her life discovering that it was not the thing she had needed most. The yachts have long since been sold. The shipping empire has changed hands. The name endures, but the woman herself, the real one, not the tabloid version, deserves to be remembered for what she actually was. Someone who loved deeply, lost repeatedly, and kept going anyway. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.